It is the month of August. This is the peak of summer. This is when water temperatures are gonna be at its hottest. Walleye fishing in a lot of places is gonna be harder in the month of August than just about anywhere, but that's not always true. We'll talk about that later in this video, but I'm gonna break down 5 tips that'll help you catch more walleyes during the month of August. So let's not waste any more time on this intro. Let's jump right into the tips. All right, tip number 1. This is the time of year when the bite can get really tough, and what you need to be doing to have success this time of year is covering water. And that's an old cliche, an old tip. You probably heard that a number of times in a number of videos, but let me talk about why it's especially important in August. So this time of year, the bite is a lot tougher, and what you'll find is the vast majority of the walleyes that you run into out on the lake are just not gonna be that hungry, that willing to bite. So what that means is you need to keep on moving along and sampling different areas, sampling different types of structure, different parts of the lake, fish that are setting up on bottom, fish that are setting up more suspended, fish that are up in the weeds, fish that are out off the weeds. You need to fish around until you figure out where the most active fish are. And there's more variables that we'll talk about a little bit later in this video, but the first thing that you need to know is that you need to keep moving. Now with that in mind, what that means to me generally is when I'm up on the trolling motor, I have it on high, I'm moving around, I'm processing, and I'm throwing at different fish, and if they're not biting, I'm moving on. I'm not wasting too much time in one area. If I find an area where there's a bunch of fish, I'm not gonna spend a bunch of time there trying to get them to bite. If they're not going, and I've cycled through a few different presentations, then I'm just gonna keep moving on. So another thing to keep in mind too, as far as just covering water and not wasting too much time in any one area, is this is a really great time to catch fish trolling, whether that's lead core trolling out off the edge, flatline trolling, up near the weeds or up near shallower cover or structure. This is a really good time to do those things just because you're processing so much water, you're moving so quickly. You'll find, let's say that you have a big giant piece of structure and there's weeds and rocks all over it and there are some walleyes scattered throughout. You'll find if you fish across that whole piece of structure, you'll find that there are gonna be a lot of walleyes, August walleyes, that are just gonna give you the middle fin. But every now and then you're gonna cast out there and that fish is gonna turn around, point up and torpedo at your bait just for no good reason. You know, the walleye's metabolism is super high this year, so when they are hungry they are gonna eat. But that's why trolling can be really effective. You know, pulling spinners on the weed lines or above weeds can be really effective this time of year because eventually you're gonna run into that walleye that's gonna be tuned up and super hungry. So that's how I like to think about moving this time of year. Don't spend too much time in one spot, and let's move on to the next tip. All right, so tip number 2 is going to be something that's a little bit esoteric, something that some of you might not care about, some of you might not even believe in, but I do believe it has some level of impact at certain times of year, and that is just paying attention to kind of lunar, I would say lunar bite windows would be the best way to explain it. So this time of year when things are tough, sometimes it's about bite windows, and the bite windows that most people know about are kind of the bite windows related to the sun. You know, it's kind of notoriously known that like midday can be tougher in the heat of the sun, heat of the summer, and morning bite, you know, that sunrise kind of morning window, and then that evening window or even after dark can be a really effective time to go catch fish. So if you're just paying attention to, you know, some of those things, I think you're gonna have more success. But with that being said, we talked earlier about, you know, if you're finding areas where there's a lot of fish, but you can't get them to bite, move on. And that for sure holds true, but pay attention to where you're seeing a lot of fish. And something to note too is like some of these areas you'll see a lot of fish, and there could be a lot of suckers and Cisco mixed in there, maybe some bass. Usually the bass will show themselves. They'll usually bite, and you'll figure out pretty quick if you're dealing with bass. But with that being said, if you found an area where you know there are some walleyes, come back to those areas either during that sunrise sunset period or during some of the moon periods. And what those moon periods are basically going to be, what you're looking at is moon rise, moon set, moon overhead, moon underfoot. And there's a bunch of different places where you can find that information. You can just look it up online. You can download an app. Actually, I've been using the Onyx app quite a bit, and the Onyx app actually has that information right on there if you pull up the weather tab. So that's really handy. But if you go back to those areas during moonrise or moonset or something like that, you will find that sometimes those fish are willing to bite. That's something that the musky guys have really paid a ton of attention to, like a lot of attention to. Walleye guys don't tend to care as much, and it might matter less for walleyes, but sometimes it does matter. I will say some really good anglers that I know for sure pay attention to it. We were just fishing a walleye league last night. The bite was so incredibly hard. We were out on Gull Lake. Really tough competitive league with some of the best anglers in the Brainerd area around, including, you know, some of the best guides and whatnot, and people that travel around and get top fives and big giant 100 boat tournaments on waters that aren't their home waters. So a lot of really good anglers in this league. And last night on Gull Lake when we were fishing, only I think it was 6 people ended up weighing some fish, which is crazy. We ended up getting second place, but the bite was just starting to fire up. What's going on back there? The bite was just starting to fire up right at the end of the evening. And if you look, you know, that was really close to a moon event. So the moon events can equal bite windows. So go back to the areas where you have fish penned up and try and get them to bite during those periods. All right, the next tip, when you're talking about the month of August, this is really the peak season for finding and catching suspended walleyes. You know, July, for me, even late June is kind of when fish start to push off of structure and suspend out in open water, but August is really the peak of it. Most of the time what we're seeing on a lot of our lakes is we're seeing that some of the smaller fish are up a little bit shallower, they're on weed lines, you know, they're on the break there, but the biggest walleyes are going to be out suspended out in deeper water. But what we've seen a couple times recently when we've been out is we were fishing a tournament on one of our local lakes around the Brainerd Lakes area, and the day that we were out, so we actually had went out earlier that week and the fish were setting up kind of in a normal traditional way, kind of like how I was just explaining, where some of the shallower fish were there's smaller fish up shallow, some of the bigger fish were more suspended, but during this tournament, like, all of the fish were suspended. The big ones, the moderate sized ones, and even some of the smaller ones as well. So it was a really interesting, it was an interesting day to be fishing. And if it was one of those things where you just pulled up to your favorite spot and, you know, dropped a Lindy rig or a jig down to the bottom and started jigging, you wouldn't have caught a walleye because there wouldn't have been any walleyes there for you to catch. So I wouldn't say that that's what happens all the time during the month of August, but I am finding that the most suspending action is happening in August. So with that being said, especially if you want to target those bigger fish, look suspended off the breaks. Now, what that might mean is suspended off of weed lines. It might mean if you're seeing like a main link hump that's, you know, topping out at 20-something feet, you may find fish suspended out in those areas. So generally, this is a good time for that. You know, when you're talking about the fall transition, which is going to be in a month or two after August, I should say, you know, some of these a lot of these fish aren't going to suspend anymore, and they're kind of going to work their way down into deeper water, onto that deeper structure. And a lot of people think about deeper structure for summer, but it just doesn't tend to be the case. You're finding more fish either up in the cover or out suspended. So if there's a time of year where you're going to look around with forward-facing sonar and drop jigs on top of and put jig heads on foreheads, August is the month to do it for sure. But it's also the absolute peak month if you're going to go out in open water and actually like troll lead core. This is the peak season for that. So when you think about this time of year, keep in mind that a lot of the fish aren't going to be where they were in June and not where they're going to be in, you know, late September and October. All right, for the next tip, I'm basically just gonna run through the 5 presentations that I have ready to go. Doesn't matter if I'm fishing a tournament, doesn't matter if I'm trying to go out and catch a limit, you know, for a fish fry, doesn't matter if I'm out with the family, out with the kids, anything like that. These are the presentations that I have on the deck ready to go. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start off with the presentation you've probably seen me throw the most, and that is just a simple jig. Usually it's a 1/8 ounce jig, could go up to a 1/4, but what I'm putting on this presentation is generally a crawler. A jig and a crawler is going to be a staple for me. I could throw a leech on the back of that, but a jig with some sort of live bait behind it is gonna be my go-to during the month of August, just because it's a presentation that's so versatile. I've talked about this a lot, so I don't need to go too deep on it, but it's a presentation that's so versatile. You can catch fish high in the water column, on the bottom, under the boat, casting it out away from the boat. You can drag this presentation, and yeah, just fish bite it really good, which is kind of a big key when you're trying to figure out what presentations you want to use. But another presentation that I always have ready as well is a jig and a plastic. So that could be a Ned rig configuration, it could be a minnow style configuration. This one here is the 4-inch eye candy minnow. Got a smeltinator head on it, 1/4 ounce, but I like tungsten heads on there as well. And also I didn't mention too, but with jig and a crawler, I love the smeltinator head. I've been using that a bunch. It's got a wildly good hook, and a good keeper as well. But the tungsten jig also has a really good keeper. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track, but nice thing about a jig and a plastic, so it's sort of situational essentially. So around home, how I will utilize this presentation is I have something that I can grab and I can whip out to any fish that I see that I feel like might bite it. So when I'm using a jig and a crawler, maybe I will cast at a big suspended fish and give it to him, you know, maybe, and when he bites it, I give it to him for a second. If I miss him on the hook set, I'll be like, oh shoot, what am I gonna do now? And usually it's turning around and grabbing this bait and firing right back into him, because it takes, you know, 30 seconds, whatever, to, you know, 30 seconds to a minute to get another night crawler ready, you know, to dig in there and hook it up and deal with this squirming worm. Or I could just grab this thing, and if that thing just ate my jig and night crawler, there's a chance that it may turn around and smack this too. And you can kind of read the mood of the fish. So I like to have this as a quick throwback option, but this is also a really good way to catch really big walleyes up in the weeds as well. So you can cast it up there and you can kind of pop it along the tops of the weeds, or you can rip jig it, the old Lindner presentation. So anyway, I love having a jig and plastic on. My wife caught her personal best walleye. All right, Jordan. What just happened?
We're just fishing on this little lake, random lake with the kids.
People jet skiing over there.
I'm like, oh hey, Carter, can I cast? I want to try. Nick's like, ooh, cast over there. There's some bass. I cast out. This thing chomps the Ned, and here it is.
And we just measured it on the stick there. A 30-inch walleye on this exact setup, a different color, shade green pumpkin on, but she caught a 30-inch walleye just a few weeks ago on this setup, a jig and a plastic. And also my daughter, we were out fishing and we weren't even, it was like a fishing trip where we weren't even really fishing, right? We were just kind of, not a fishing trip, a day on the water where we weren't really fishing. We were tubing and swimming and all that, and we pulled over to one spot to see if we could catch something interesting, and she cast it out, you know, into this area in the weeds there where, you know, I knew there were some bass and whatever, and she ended up getting smoked by like a big, it was like 29 inches and change. So this exact presentation, again, a 1/4 ounce jig, and then just the 4-inch eye candy minnow. So always have a jig and plastic ready, just because you can fish it so quickly, so efficiently. You don't have to rebait it. dab a little super glue right on the back side of the head and then fit that piece of plastic up there. And this thing is going to be just a bulletproof presentation. Another one, just real quick, is a drop shot. Drop shots are something, it's so funny. We were fishing that tournament, we were fishing a tournament last night, me and Brett, and we ended up sticking one on a drop shot, and we were like, God, we should have been using drop shots a little bit more. I feel like we maybe could have got a couple more bites, but drop shotting is just a presentation that works really, really well, and it gets fish to bite when you otherwise might have a hard time getting them to bite. The only downside to this is it's not as versatile. It's basically a presentation for the bottom. You know, you can kind of work that bait along fish that are suspended a little higher, but if there's a fish on the bottom, there's not, it's tough to say, but there's not really a better way to consistently get bites than with a drop shot. You can put a plastic on there, you know, a smaller plastic, like a little 3-inch minnow profile or something like that. Actually, that new eye candy jig and leech is actually a great presentation on a drop shot. But otherwise, you can put a leech on here or a night crawler as well. That's what I'm doing a lot when I'm fishing really pressured fish. But, you know, I'm going to be going to Rainy Lake here pretty soon with a couple of my buddies, Brett and TJ, and probably be throwing a lot of plastics on drop shots. And also this last presentation, the jig and a 4-inch plastic, that is going to be a staple up on Rainy Lake. I probably won't even get any live bait while I'm up there. We'll see, no promises, but I think this is going to be, you know, just as effective as live bait is back around home. Another presentation that I'm going to be using a ton on Rainy Lake probably is the old puppet. So glide bait like this in the month of August is just a good way if you're seeing fish in deep water, especially near the bottom. You can catch some fish higher in the water column with this as well if you fish it a certain way, but usually when you're seeing like that bump down on the bottom, you cast this thing out there, give it a few rips. If they don't bite, move on. You know, a drop shot is a good presentation for those same fish, but when the bite is really tough, you know, like the tournament that we were just recently fishing, the bite was very difficult. One of our fish came on a glide bait. Brett poked one on a glide bait, and sometimes when the fish aren't willing to bite anything, which can happen a lot in August, you can make some hay with a big glide bait like this, just because it drops down onto them really fast. They don't know where it came from, and they have to make a split-second decision whether or not they want to take a bite of it. So always have a glide bait tied up this time of year. And last but certainly not least is the bobber. I don't use the bobber as much as I feel like I could or should, but obviously in some situations the bobber is just going to get more bites than anything, just because it's the most finesse presentation. You can basically just hover a leech or a crawler or a minnow in place for an infinite amount of time. So do not leave the bobber at home. I don't have to go too much deeper on the bobber. Yeah, I think I just recently did a video on bobber fishing. So yeah, I think I did, yes. So you can watch that video if you want more information. I'm forgetting what videos I've done recently. But those are the 5 presentations. Jig and a live bait, so jig and a crawler, jig and a plastic, a bobber, a drop shot, and some sort of glide bait. So I'd like to go deeper into all those presentations. Maybe I will in a future video, but I know this segment's already getting really long, so just make sure you have these presentations tied up. All right, tip number 5 to catch more walleyes in the month of August is one thing I like to think about this time of year is I like to look at big weed flats where I know there are walleyes in the area. So oftentimes you will find fish at different levels related to that weed flat. So I'm gonna pull up the map here and just kind of explain to you what I'm talking about. So look at all this area right here. So let's assume all of the green area is where the weeds are. So let's say there's a weed line kind of going along here. So what you'll find is some of the walleyes will be directly on the edge of the weeds. You'll also find that there will be some walleye sitting on top of the weeds, not too far off the edge, but they'll be suspended up over the weeds. Sometimes they're buried in the weeds too. It just kind of, you know, depends on the weather and kind of how they're setting up and whether or not they're feeding. But often the ones that you're looking for are suspended up atop the weeds. So you have the weed lines, you have a little bit into the weeds on top, and then you'll also find if these areas are holding walleyes. Sometimes these weed flats will be holding primarily bass and there'll be less walleyes, but if there are some walleyes in the area, you'll also find that some of these fish will be sneaking out onto some of the deeper structure that's just off of these weed lines. So you may find fish kind of working their way out, like see these little fingers that are kind of coming off of the weed line. Those are areas that I'm gonna be looking as well. And then the final kind of layer of where you might find fish as it relates to these weed lines is you're gonna find them out suspended around the outside edges. And obviously the walleyes are gonna be sneaking out into here chasing bait fish and, you know, chasing after some of those bug hatches and whatnot. But generally I'm looking a little bit closer to structure. So there's a number of different layers where you may find fish. So basically what my strategy is going to be is I'm going to start out, you know, kind of right around the weed edge where I can kind of see the weed line, but I can also see some of that open water. And I'm just going to work through this area and I'm going to look around over here. Are there any fish? And I'm going to pan over in this direction. I'm going to look towards the weed line, kind of peek over onto the tops of the weeds every now and then, and I'm just going to work through this area, looking around, kind of zigzagging, seeing what I can find, looking in this bowl area, you know, looking up on the edges here. And if you just work through areas like this, you're going to find some fish are up in the weeds. You're going to find in this exact same stretch, this exact same little area, you're gonna find some of the fish are gonna be out suspended. You're gonna find some fish, you know, that are deeper sitting on the edge of structure, you know, maybe some of these hard breaks like that. So there's gonna be walleyes all throughout these areas, and the biggest reason is because you have that weed flat there. You have the area where all that food is going to be concentrating. There's going to be perch, sunfish, minnows, all types of stuff for the walleyes to eat. And then on the outside, you know, if it's a deeper body of water, you may have ciscos or suspended forage, and you're going to have bug hatches out here. But this kind of creates kind of a bonanza, you know, where they can basically go to the buffet and they can, you know, be up in the weeds or they can slide out. There's a number of things they can do. But areas like this are some of my absolute favorite in the month of August. And a lot of the best bites that I'm finding are in areas that look exactly like what I just showed you on the map. So I feel like this whole video got a little bit long. It's hard for me to stay as tight and concise without losing some of the good information that I really want to share. So anyway, that's the whole video. 5 tips to catch walleyes in August, but I will add one more quick bonus tip. So don't leave yet. The reason this was a bonus tip and not one of the original 5 tips is because it's not going to be applicable to very many of the people watching, but there is a misconception that walleye fishing is always the worst in August, no matter where you go. But there's somewhere where that is definitely not true, and that is anywhere north of the US-Canadian border. So we are going to Rainy Lake here this next week. It's gonna be a lot of fun. Me and my buddies Brett and TJ, we're gonna film, we're gonna catch a bunch of walleyes for sure, hopefully some really big ones. But what a lot of people don't understand is that the month of August is actually probably the best month for catching walleyes north of the border. The middle of summer, it just seems like you can catch more fish. You're gonna catch some of the bigger fish. You know, everybody talks about spring and fall and how, you know, walleye fishing doesn't get any better in those months than, you know, any other time of year. But August in Canada is just magical, and the fish are setting up on deep structure. They're easy to catch. They're willing to bite glide baits, you know, rip and jig in a plastic, swim baits, stuff like that. So I'm jacked to get up there and chase some fish, because I know that August is generally the best month anywhere north of the border. So anyway, that's the whole video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would say check out this one right here. This is a video I put up somewhat recently. That is basically me just running through everything you need to know to catch walleyes on bobbers. Bobbers are stupidly effective, and doesn't matter what time of year, whether it's August or any other month, you should always have a bobber tied on.